Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Stefano Feltri. I work at the Stigler Center as a senior editor of ProMarket, our digital publication. I recommend you to check our website, promarket.org, and I especially recommend you to check it in a couple of days when we will have a new layout on the website. Will look much nicer. We are delighted today to continue the Stigler Center Monopolies and Politics Workshop series. And today we have our guest, Professor Yishay Yafeh, on regulating conglomerates. The next seminar of this series will be in 2 weeks on May 28th with Richard John, Steve Haber, and the event will be moderated by Professor Luigi Zingales. After the presentation and the discussion, the last 15 minutes today will be devoted to Q&A. So please submit your questions via the Q&A button on Zoom. Before we begin, allow me to briefly introduce our guest. Yishay Yafeh is a professor at the School of Business Administration of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He holds a PhD in economics from Harvard, and he has taught to Oxford, Montreal, and the Hebrew University. From 2010 to 2016, he served as Vice Dean and as a Dean of the School of Business Administration of the Hebrew University. And his research interests are financial system, financial intermediation, the economies of East Asia, and economic and financial history. In particular, he's one of the leading experts of corporate pyramids, and you will understand what they are and all the details in a few minutes. And I definitely recommend you the article that Yishay wrote for ProMarket a few days ago with his co-authors, and the title is Using Regulation to Dismantle Power for Corporate Pyramids. So I turn over to Yishay, and we will have a Q&A after his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this kind introduction. So I guess it's not the same as being physically in Chicago at the conference that was supposed to take place today. But on the other hand, I don't have to spend 15 hours on the plane plus security, etc. So we'll see in the end if it was worthwhile. Anyway, this is based on several different papers with different co-authors. I will mention very briefly, but basically you will see and you can read more on this blog and on my website. When you think about public policy or government regulation of big business, there is this tendency, or it seems like there is a cycle, right? So there are all kinds of new technologies or innovations, which at the beginning we sort of think very highly of. Then we start fearing that maybe these new technologies and the entrepreneurs behind them have accumulated too much monopoly power, public sentiment may change, and then regulation follows. If you think I'm talking about Google, Amazon, or Facebook, I didn't mean that, but keep the analogy in mind, and we'll talk about this later. And this sort of pattern was observed in the 19th century in America with the robber barons and the railways, etc. And this new technology ended with the introduction of antitrust in America. It was repeated to some extent in the 1930s. Then the high tech was public utilities, telephone, electricity, etc. And we may be experiencing part of this cycle with the big tech today, and maybe we'll go back to this at the end. The presentation today is about the experience of 4 different countries in different time periods in implementing policies towards a particular type of big business, that is the pyramidal business group. Think of Samsung, but I'll show you in a minute what I mean by this. One sentence of introduction: when we think about corporate America, we typically think of standalone companies with many small atomistic shareholders, dispersed ownership. But when you look around the world, you very often find corporate structures that look like this. This is Canada, yes, the Bronfman family So all kinds of related companies with partial ownership, but at the end, at the apex, at the top, you very often have a family which controls a corporate empire through these indirect holdings, which is far larger than what an entrepreneur could ever achieve holding just one company or fully owning a small number of companies. Here is another business group from South Africa. This one is the largest in the world, and we'll talk about this. This, of course, is Samsung. And there is a huge literature about them. I'm going to be very brief, given that this is, you know, you are in Chicago, or some of you are in Chicago, and there is this joke about American tourists visiting 15 countries in 3 days. So I'm going to do 120 years of history very briefly. Basically, the literature about these corporate entities has a bright side and a dark side. The bright side basically says that all these complicated ownership structures or pyramids or business groups may be important in economic development in early stages when the country or the economy is underdeveloped. So for example, if financial markets are underdeveloped, then an internal capital market within the Samsung group may overcome this deficiency or institutional void. You can make the same argument about internal labor markets, the allocation, training and allocation of labor within a group, enforcement of contracts, and many other stories. But then as a country develops, you're typically left with 4 problems associated with these pyramidal or very large corporate structure. One is a monopoly power, the other is political power, talking about the current series of presentations. Then there is a lot of talk about conflicts between controlling and minority shareholders, which we sometimes call tunneling, family control, and in particular inherited wealth, which gives the family controls over very large chunks of an economy. So as an example, the family that controls Samsung controls assets which are larger than or bigger than some countries. And then there is a concern about possible involvement of these entities in finance, resulting in the possibility, at least, of misallocation of capital, excessive risk, and so on. And this is why these large corporate entities, at least in some countries, have been the target of regulation and public policy to address these deficiencies or downsides once the alleged economic benefits are no longer relevant. And what I'm going to do today in an extremely rushed fashion, and maybe we can talk more slowly afterwards, is talk about 4 countries and their experience in regulating these extremely large, powerful corporate entities spanning many industries and many affiliates. I will talk briefly about America in the 1930s and early 40s, the New Deal policies. I will talk, maybe spend more time on Japan, the dissolution of the pyramidal business group by the American occupation authorities after World War II. I will just mention Korea very briefly, since there was a presentation about Korea 2 or so weeks ago by Professor Park, and then describe what's been done in Israel during the last decade, and maybe draw some lessons from this about how or what are the efficient or effective ways of curbing the influence or regulating large, complex, diverse corporate entities. And if you like, we'll talk about the lessons for what we are experiencing today afterwards. Very, very briefly, what I want to say is that these large corporate entities are unlikely to dissolve or shrink on their own. The private benefits to the controllers are very different than the public benefits, and what's typically, or what seems to be effective, are specifically designed policies or regulatory tools rather than using existing tools like antitrust or corporate governance regulations. and doing this, that may be obvious, in the right political circumstances and in a consistent way over time. So very, very briefly, here you see my co-authors on this project. What happened in America? We think of America as being what it is today, many companies with dispersed ownership, but this is corporate America in the 1930s, taken from the Bible, Burleigh Means. America looked more like Korea than like England in the 1930s. Here are, by some measures, how prevalent these groups were in America and how they shrink starting in the late 1930s to the 1940s. And by 1950, they are more or less gone. And America, corporate America, looks more like it is today. What is the secret? I won't go into the details of how we try to measure this, but it's primarily based on archival data and attempts to measure empirically the influence of different types of regulatory policies. And the ones in red are the ones specifically designed by President Roosevelt to diminish the influence of corporate pyramids. The first one, the Public Utilities Holding Company Act, restricted their size and scope of activities. The second one provided an incentive for them to shrink. And the third one limited the freedom of action of holding companies. The regulatory tools in blue were basically existing tools. They didn't do that much. So pyramids disappeared in America primarily because during an extreme political circumstances, specifically designed measures were applied over a long time period, and corporate America changed more or less forever, or maybe until, at least until recent decades. Again, more details we can talk about later if you find this interesting. Japan. So Japan has, well, Japan was characterized by 4 families controlling 4 very extensive pyramids, which basically dominated the entire modern sector of the Japanese economy from the late 19th century until the end of World War II. All kinds of good things they may have done to precipitate Japan's industrialization and modernization initially. But then once Japan or the American occupation period begins in Japan after the war, these groups are associated with several major evils, like they were beneficiaries from the war. They created inequality, which was associated with the rise of fascism in Japan. They had monopoly power and so on. And so this is one of the major targets of the American occupation period in Japan, other than, you know, changing the constitution, the status of the emperor, and so on and so forth. And in many ways, the dissolution of these pyramids in Japan, where they were called zaibatsus, is the largest change in corporate ownership in modern history until the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's something like 30 or 40% of all assets in the economy changed hands. And this is done by force. It's basically done through a restriction or prohibition on holding companies, shares held by families and individuals involved in the zaibatsu companies, cross-shareholding, etc., were all transferred to a special body set up by the American occupation authorities called the HCLC, the Holding Company Liquidation Commission. And the HCLC makes a deliberate effort to create dispersed ownership in Japan. It takes all the shares held by the zaibatsu families and zaibatsu affiliates and more or less distributes at least the bulk of them to local residents living in cities where the zaibatsu firms or plants were operating, and to employees of these companies. They also planned and did some of this, but not completely, planned to break some companies with market power, remove executives, purge them, but not in the Stalinist sense, but basically purge them and prohibit them from holding office. The families that controlled the group received compensation in nominal terms. This was eroded in the inflation after the war, and they disappear from the stage. Importantly, I'll come back to this point, banks in the groups were left untouched. This is primarily because by the time the Americans reached the point of reforming the banks, the bigger fear was that Japan, God forbid, might become communist rather than become a military threat again. And so the banks were left untouched. This is the bottom line of this. See what happened to corporate Japan following the American reform to dissolve the zaibatsus groups. This is taken from a book by the late Stanford economist Masahiko Aoki. You can see, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but at the beginning, 1949, individual shareholding in Japan is at an all-time high. But then trading resumes, the Tokyo Stock Exchange, which had been bombed, reopens. And all these individuals who received shares through the American reforms begin to sell. And they sell, and the buyers are financial institutions, the banks, which were left untouched, and other corporations with ties to these the same companies from the pre-war period. So we can talk more about this episode, which I think is fascinating when there is more time later. But again, if you think about this story in like very broad brush terms, again, very extreme political circumstances, specifically designed regulatory measures here, forced breakup, consistent pressure for 7 years when the Americans were in Japan, maybe not long enough. The attempt to exogenously enforce a dispersed ownership structure didn't seem to work in Japan. We can talk about whether or not this is related to the law and finance theories or other stories. A very similar thing happened in Czechoslovakia when it was still Czechoslovakia rather than the Czech Republic 40 years later. And maybe two other possible lessons which we could go back to from the history of Japan is the outcomes of a very large scale reform in corporate ownership is very hard to predict. So no pyramids in Japan anymore, no families, etc., but an ownership structure which is very different from the dispersed structure that the Americans had envisaged. And perhaps another part of the story is that banks or financial institutions were left untouched during these reforms, and then they became the core of corporate ownership in Japan after the war. I'll come back to this, but in Israel as well, removing financial institutions from the groups was a core part of the regulatory policy. Like I said, this is a very long bit of history and 4 countries in a rush. So I hope you have questions or comments and I can elaborate a little bit more later. Korea, you've heard about the Korean business groups, the Chaebol, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, etc. You probably have one of their products in your parking lot or in your pocket. Again, extremely diversified, large family-controlled groups. Lots of stories about how these groups initially contributed to the growth or the rags to riches story of the Korean economy. Close ties of these groups with the government, just like the Japanese groups, government contracts, government favors through subsidized loans, tax breaks, etc., etc. Once Korea becomes a democracy in 1998, the balance of power between the groups and the government tilts towards the groups. Before, the groups were dependent on government support. Now, with democracy, Korea, you've heard this term, the Republic of Samsung, the groups have tremendous influence, and they're associated with 1 million types of, or 1 million scandals. You've heard about this. both minority shareholder expropriation, but also corruption, ties to the government, attempts to influence regulation, restrict competition, etc., etc. In a sentence, in 1997-98, it's the Asian financial crisis. Korea goes from, suddenly from being a tiger to virtual bankruptcy. People start thinking that the groups called chaebol may have been at fault for their high leverage, excessive growth, bad investment, etc. Korea needs a bailout from the IMF, and together with IMF reformers and the new reform-oriented president who takes power after the crisis, there is this decision to do something about the chaebol. I will skip this, and again, we can go into the details later, but the main tool that was chosen was corporate governance reforms. So transparency, outside directors, fair treatment of minority shareholders, stuff like this, yes? Maybe more openness to foreign ownership. And the result, as you can see in this figure, which shows you, I don't know if you can see the axis, because for me, the pictures cover the photos cover the axis, but this is the size of the largest groups. In blue, it is today, in red is 10 years ago, and in yellow, 20 years ago, after the crisis. And what you can see here is that the largest group, which is Samsung, is far larger today than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. The second largest, which is Hyundai, the same. The third largest, and so on. So groups in Korea are still an issue, as you've heard from Professor Park. Using corporate governance tools to try and regulate this, their excessive power doesn't work. It doesn't work either because it doesn't address the real issues, which are monopoly and political power. And maybe the story in Korea is not that corporate, or not just that corporate governance is inappropriate. It's also that the political support, so going back to the comparisons with the other two countries, political support for chaebol reform in Korea was short-lived. Presidents or pro-reform presidencies didn't last long. And maybe Korea is not just about the wrong tools, but also about limited support. I will do Israel very briefly because I'm running out of time. Here is an Israeli group that is in the news these days because it's going to go bankrupt, hopefully as we speak. Concentration of wealth in Israel by holdings by the largest families. So not quite like Korea, but more than most Western economies when we look at Israel 10 years ago. Mostly the work of Costa Kotsenko is behind this. And what happens is that, again, very, very briefly, initially, people in Israel thought of this as a governance problem. And there were issues or thoughts about regulating these pyramids using governance tools. In the end, this approach was rejected. And something that was much more like the American Roosevelt approach was adopted. So separating financial from non-financial firms within the group, so that these groups have to choose financial operations or non-financials. They can't do both. Restrictions on the formation of new pyramids, or basically on the number of levels in existing pyramids, no more than 2. This is very similar to the Public Utilities Holding Company Act of Roosevelt in 1935. And the third one, which is original, and we can talk about more later, an economy-wide application of antitrust. So we are not just talking about the concentration in of sellers in a specific industry, but also about economy-wide concentration of economic power by certain individuals or companies, even if they hold small amounts in given industries. In addition to this, there were some restrictions imposed by the central bank on lending to business groups and on the ability to use a leverage to acquire control blocks. I'll skip the details and we can go back to them. And here are the results, which in many ways have been very successful. Here you see, again, the technical details we can talk about later, a decline in the number of groups and in the market share of group affiliated companies. This is a different way of presenting this, and I'm nearly out of time, so let me just conclude very briefly what I think are the main lessons from these 4 historical episodes. One is perhaps an obvious one, but I should state it: policy consistency over a long time period, as in the US, to some extent in Israel, where this has been going on for about a decade. In Japan, maybe the unexpected outcomes were related to the fact that after 7 years of American occupation, the policies changed. And Korea, as we've seen, may be an example of short-term policies, attempts to use various tools. They have tried various tools other than governance, but all very briefly before reverting to a more pro-big business approach. The other possible lesson is not using just one tool, but rather multiple regulatory tools, and the ones introduced specifically for this particular purpose, rather than traditional antitrust, which didn't work in America. There is evidence, both quantitative and in Roosevelt's speeches, or corporate governance as in Korea. Political support for such moves, I guess, is an obvious topic to discuss in this seminar. And finally, the example from Japan and the counter example from Israel perhaps suggests that financial institutions should be separated from big business groups as a way to curb their influence. Korea, by the way, has done some of this. Banks are, or the chaebol, the Korean groups, are not allowed to control banks, but they are allowed to control other financial institutions. And, you know, perhaps this is one of the things that have been missing in Korean reforms. Maybe I'll stop here. I've run a little bit overboard. Stefano, is this okay?
Sure. No, you're perfectly on time.
Shall I stop the screen sharing?
No, I think you can.
Okay, okay, I'll leave it in case.
Yeah, just a few minutes that we collect some questions. I ask the people to write in the chat. We have the first one. I start with a question of mine. You mentioned that you need some extraordinary situation to have the political pressure for this kind of reforms. So the obvious question is if this COVID-19 epidemic is that kind of extraordinary situation, because what we are actually seeing is that there is a process of consolidation. So the last news was that Uber is probably buying a Grubhub, and they will have more than 50% of food delivery market. So we are probably coming out from this crisis with a more concentrated market with new conglomerates. So how do you see this situation compared to the countries you studied? And then we turn to the question from listeners.
Okay, so you're asking me to do something that no economist would do, which is predict the future. I mean,
or to highlight the differences between this context and previous.
I think you know, be very cautiously. I think this crisis, more than other crises, is extreme in its differential impact on large companies or more techy companies relative to smaller and traditional ones. And in that sense, it's quite likely that the biggest companies, at least in the tech companies, are going to emerge larger and more powerful from this crisis. And the public atmosphere, again, without, you know, risking any predictions, but to the extent that there will be chunks of the US or other economies which will be severely hurt by this crisis, there may be a public sentiment which will facilitate reforms or regulation. But that's, you know, very risky and speculative. I mean, I should say that 3 of these countries are really examples of regulation driven or initiated during crisis periods. In Israel, there was no serious crisis that initiated the anti-big business reform. There was more a public sentiment about limited competition, cost of living and stuff like this. So the crisis is not essential, but it is, you know, I think it stands to reason that reforms, especially big ones, are easier to implement during periods of crisis. Sorry for not doing.
No. I mean, I know that I was asking something that no economists want to do, like to predict how the world will look like after this crisis.
I mean, I think the contribution of these papers, in a way, is telling people stories about the past that some of them were not known. So at least this we try to do.
Yeah, and we have a question on this from Augustin Hurtado, who works at Booth as an economist. And he's asking if there is any case study on regulating conglomerates in developing world, because basically all the countries you mentioned are different stage of development, but they are considered like developed countries.
Yes, excellent. So the short answer is no. And the reason, I mean, there are 2 reasons for or at least not that I know of, I should say. 2 reasons. One is the balance between the good things that these business groups do and the bad things. The balance is different in early stages of development. So you might make a fairly convincing argument that in the 1960s and 70s, say, these groups were important for Korean economic growth because they make up for institutional voids, things that are missing in the economy. My co-author, Tarun Khanna, has done a lot of work on these things in India. So you might imagine the good things that they do in poor countries. It's the balance between the good and the bad or the bad things that stay afterwards, which enable possible reform or regulation afterwards. So I think, there may have been cases in developing countries, but it's much more likely that rich or developed countries would try this rather than emerging markets.
Okay, we have a question from Melike Harslan from Northwestern, I think, that go directly to the heart of the debate. So why you are so skeptical that antitrust alone is that antitrust is an effective tool to deal with pyramidal corporate power? And Melike asking a question that it seems is due to the reinterpretation of antitrust in the 70s to not apply to diversified firms operating in multiple markets. But before then, US antitrust was active in preventing such power concentration. Why we can't go back to that type of antitrust and why regulatory directives are better? Before, I fear that regulatory actors are easier to capture than antitrust enforcers. That's a very important issue, like regulatory capture. So how you answer to this? Is this antitrust ineffective or just the current way of interpreting antitrust role that is not working?
Okay, thank you for this question. So if you go back to the 1930s, first it's interesting, and I'd be happy to provide a reference. It's interesting that Roosevelt explicitly in his speeches, partly in Congress, I think, partly during elections, he explicitly says that existing antitrust rules are not enough, and therefore comes up with the ideas to initiate new regulatory tools like the Public Utilities Holding Company Act or the Intercorporate Dividend Tax, etc. I should also add, before directly answering this question, that part of this paper on the US in the 1930s that I alluded to during the presentation, we look at the number of antitrust cases that were actually brought against corporate pyramids in America during this period, and the number is extremely small. When you try to see whether or not the actual application of antitrust was directly involved in shrinking US pyramids, the basic answer to this is no, although it may have been part of the anti-big business atmosphere or politics. Why is this so? I can only venture a guess. I think when you're talking about Samsung or a Samsung-like entity, it is a very indirect tool to say that Samsung is very powerful in, say, the electronics industry. Its power exceeds or stretches many industries and many dimensions. And this is also the rationale behind the Israeli law that antitrust in this context should be applied also on an economy-wide basis, so that if there is a government contract or privatization, we should also take into the account the market or political power of the relevant company or party in other industries. Now, you may say, and this is true, that we have good theoretical foundations for using antitrust at an industry level, and we have fewer say models explaining, what is excessive economic concentration at an economy, at the country-wide level, etc. But I think the essence is that these multi-industry entities are, the problems cannot be easily addressed with a tool that is essentially industry specific. So that is my long answer to this.
No, but it's very interesting because the point of this series and of the antitrust conference in September is exactly this one. So that market power is simply one form of power, but it's mainly power. So if you are power in like Samsung is powerful, whatever definition of power you use, not power
and
only.
It is powerful in industries where it currently does not have a big market share, right? It is potentially powerful in terms of leveraging its financial wealth or regulatory capture or whatever you like to enter industries where it currently does not have market power. So standard antitrust might not be able to capture this. Do you have a minute for an anecdote?
Sure, and then because
a minute
this is
for
the
an
core
anecdote. So maybe 10 years ago, there was this seminar of the antitrust commissioners of the OECD countries in Paris, or their chief economist or something, and I had to make a presentation. This idea was in its infancy, the idea of economy-wide concentration. And the representative from Sweden said, we have the Wallenberg Group, which is very large. It's even larger than Samsung relative to Sweden's GDP. And we have no problem with this. What are you talking about? But the representative from Korea, the representative from Italy, knew exactly what I was talking about. So I think this is the essence. You need something that addresses the economy-wide power rather than industry-specific measures of high prices or concentrated sellers, etc. Sorry.
Okay, that was very interesting, but it drives us to the question that Luigi Zingales wrote in the Q&A chat, because Luigi is asking, you mentioned that Korea and Chaebol gained power in democracy, but what kept them in check under a dictatorship? Is this the opposite what people say about the relationship between monopoly and fascism? That, the traditional narrative is that monopoly led to fascism, but you say that the Chaebol problems became bigger when Korea was democratic. So how do you reconcile this?
Okay, so this is my take, and it's just an opinion. Okay, so during the 60s and 70s, the fast growth of Korea is led by this development-oriented dictator, General Park. And the chaebol, the groups were relatively small at the time. They start growing when the government awards them all kinds of contracts and subsidized loans and encourages these potentially successful entrepreneurs. Like supposedly the founder of Hyundai had a garage to fix American Jeeps during the Korean War. But he turned out to be a successful entrepreneur through government contracts, shipbuilding, a bridge over the Han River in Seoul, heavy industry, subsidized government loans to start off the automobile industry, et cetera, et cetera. I should say in parentheses that when you look at the history of Meiji Japan in the 19th century, it is sort of the same. Yes, initially the pro-reform Meiji government, which had some government-owned model factories which were copying European technology from England and Germany, etc., they privatized them to entrepreneurs or business people who were connected to the government. But initially they were dependent on the government for contracts, for government support in multiple ways, et cetera, et cetera. And at some point it changes. And when you move from, so I'm in no way advocating dictatorship or anything like that, but I say when Korea moved to democracy, politicians suddenly dependent on big business for donations, for campaigns, etc. When Japan became sort of a democracy early in the 20th century, each one of the big groups controlled or owned, if you like, a party in the Japanese parliament in the 1910s, yes, the equivalent of the Weimar period in Japan. So I think these developmental states, so to speak, can keep the groups at check. So I'm not saying that this is a good thing in terms of welfare, etc. I'm saying that the balance of power between these big corporate entities and the government there are some cases in which I'm being very careful. It changes following transition to democracy because the groups become essential for politicians seeking office.
Yeah, that's very scaring in a way, but it's it's very interesting. I go to a question by Aldo Musacchio from Brandeis University.
Oh, I haven't seen him in a long time, yes.
Because it's really connected to what you were saying. He asked, you and many of your co-authors have emphasized the idea that conglomerates are a response to institutional voids. Yet institutions have a major improvements in developing countries, and business group just keep getting stronger. Does this mean that we should rethink the theory of business groups?
Excellent. So thank you, Aldo, for this question. So I sort of rushed through it, but the rationale for why business groups should be regulated in wealthy or developed economies is precisely this point. So the social benefits from keeping these or big business groups or pyramids, the social benefits making up for institutional voids, all of these arguments lose some of their value as a country develops. But for the owners, the private benefits of keeping a group do not disappear together with the social benefits. So it is a classic case for government regulation. The private benefits from power, from family control, from potential succession, all kinds of things you can imagine, they stay on. They stay on in Chile after the market-oriented reforms. There is evidence of this. They stay in Korea. Well, I mean, there are Italians here, but I would say they stay in Italy. And so the precise reason, by the way, there are also models sort of showing this, right? So by Daniel Wolfensohn and Almeida, etc. So the economic rationale for targeting these groups as a sort of a policy objective is precisely the concept or the premise They won't disappear on their own because the private benefits to the owners are not the same as the social benefits from to society from their existence.
Okay. Let's go back to the developed countries, because we have Lucas Gribler da Motta, and he asks a very precise question. 2 weeks ago, in one of these seminars, we heard that the decartelization office failed in Germany. You are saying that it succeeded in Japan. Can you say a bit more why? Is it because they acted faster in Japan, or was it connected to the business structure, the previous business structure in that was different in different countries?
Okay, so I mean, comparisons between Japan and Germany are you know, very often made not just because of the war, but also because of the nature of the financial system and perhaps other features of the economy in the post-war period. I'm not an expert on the American reforms in Germany. I am going to say one thing which may or may not be true. So it's purely speculative, but I think, and there was this seminar here about Germany, I guess 2 weeks ago or something like this. I think in Germany, there was never, I mean, the prevalence of pyramids, of families controlling firms or affiliates in multiple industries, and the sort of total dominance of the economy by a small number of families. I think I may well be wrong, but I think that this never reached the same level in Germany as in Japan. So there are all these famous German industrialists, I don't know, Krupp, Thyssen, etc. But I don't think these, I may be wrong, so I want to qualify this, but I don't think they control pyramids or entities outside their core industry. And therefore the American reforms in Germany were not focused on the same thing, the structure of a small number of families which basically dominated the entire modern part of the Japanese economy, not just this specific industry. But I may be wrong. I'm not an expert on German history.
We will have time to discuss maybe in the Antitrust Conference in September if the COVID pandemic will stop.
Yes.
Will allow us, yes. We have a very short question by Debolina Dutta. I hope to pronounce it correctly. She's a law student, or I think it's she. But I think that we'll take a very long answer to this short question, because the question is, in the post-AT&T era, antitrust laws cannot be trusted, I guess because they are not effective enough, as you were saying before. What alternatives can be developed or are at disposal already to ensure markets are new entrants friendly?
Okay, so it's
a very broad question. So yeah, I know that it's difficult. So
let me just try. So if I guess standard antitrust, I'm going to repeat partly what I've said before, but rephrase it slightly. So standard antitrust is supposedly good for maintaining competition within a given industry if we think or we measure consumer welfare through prices primarily, right? So that's the standard doctrine. Now, what do I do in America when in the 19th, or what did Roosevelt and his administration do in America in the 1930s when you have DuPont or Morgan or other entities in many industries? So this affects competition, potential competition, not just because you know, Samsung can crush any potential entrant into the cell phone industry, but because in general, it's hard to be a small fish in a pond where the likes of Samsung are dominant. So I think what was done in the 1930s and in many ways is fantastic with the perspective of a 70-year, you know, hindsight, is a mix of measures that were designed together to make the economy much more prone to competition. So, pyramids are not going to be taller or larger than 2 levels. That makes the likes of Samsung much less likely, right? Because you cannot build a vast corporate empire if you are only allowed to have 2 levels. Yes, so that's the public. This was applied to public utilities, but the concept, yes, the intercorporate dividend tax is an economist's favorite because it provides incentives against the establishment of very tall pyramids where each time a dividend is paid, it is taxed. And the Investment Company Act, or basically a restriction on the freedom of holding companies, restricts the appeal of setting up companies whose main purpose is holding the shares of other companies. So in that sense, it's like a set of comprehensive measures which are designed to make the economy as a whole, not a specific industry, less prone to having tall, vast, multi-industry corporate entities controlled by a single family. I mean, you can think about other measures to achieve this. We can talk about the inheritance tax, etc. But this is like going very directly to towards the objective that I forget now the name of the person who asked this question, but very directly towards addressing this in an economy-wide fashion. I hope I sort of answered the question.
I think it's clear. I mean, at the end of the day, it's the big message of your research that power is power. I mean, it's not like antitrust is not industry related, but market power is something that we should consider in a broader perspective. And this is also something that Augustine again is asking, and he's relating to Aldo's question, to Aldo Mosacchio's question. And Augustine Hurtado is asking, shouldn't we add political factors to the institutional void theories? And he mentioned the example of Chile because he's from Chile. And he said that in Chile's case, people that work in government during the dictatorship became businessmen in key sectors of the economy after being powerful public servants. Okay, cool. So basically they amassed huge political power and economic power afterwards. So maybe after a certain level of economic development, institutional voids are filled, but the political consequences of conglomerates are the ones that keep them growing. So I think that the question is, I mean, there is no real institutional void if the power moves from politics to business and again. So, I mean, it's very difficult to deal with it.
Yes, so it is related to Aldo's question, right? So if you think about these entities as being formed, excuse me, being formed initially really to overcome economic problems or economic deficiencies of underdevelopment, then over time these entrepreneurs who've been very successful and may have helped orchestrate successful, Korea is of course a fantastic example of economic growth. They become, I guess my co-author and friend Randall Mork likes to use the term entrenchment. Yes, so they become politically powerful. They are, Randall has this theory that these groups are also very good at or have some advantages at lobbying, at rent seeking, at capturing, gaining and maintaining political power. In Israel, one of the groups made it a sort of a strategy to hire civil servants from the Israel Securities Authority, that's the equivalent of the SEC, immediately when they leave office. Maybe they could plan on it even ex ante. So it's quite plausible that initially the motivations are primarily economic, maybe also related to the, family wealth of the founding entrepreneurs. but the maintenance of this power is very much related to the ability of these groups to influence politics, regulation, the media, and so forth. And this is a question that has not come up yet. It is one of the explanations why it is so difficult to get rid of them once they are so big and entrenched. Yes, so why is it that I only have these 4 countries to tell you stories from? Why is it that other countries, including in Europe, Italy, Belgium, so Sweden, may be happy with the current corporate ownership structure, but why is it a feature of so few countries? And this is, I think, because of this entrenchment problem.
Okay, we have very few minutes, so maybe you have time for last question, and I have one. I know that you do not want to do like a forecast for the future, but maybe you can explain something on the past. So how was possible that zaibatsu in Japan, they became so big before the war? I mean, do you see any comparison also what consolidation process in other moments of history, and what lesson we can take from the consolidation process?
Thank you for this question. I think in many ways the story of Japan is amazing, and it's worth, it's somehow not very well known. So a few minutes on this. So how were the groups in Japan formed? So in the last third of the 19th century, Japan starts or embarks on its modernization period. That's called the Meiji Restoration, etc. Tries to catch up with European powers. Initially, it's a government orchestrated development, and then the government cannot maintain the factories or model plants as they were called, and they privatize them. And then continue industrialization by sort of outsourcing, if you like, the process of industrialization to a small group of trustworthy entrepreneurs. Trustworthy in terms of their political inclinations and in terms of their entrepreneurial abilities. And these entrepreneurs accumulate power, right? Shipbuilding, heavy industry, chemicals, etc. There are 4 large groups, family controlled, and then 6 smaller groups, depending how you count, or a little bit more. They accumulate power, they accumulate political power in the 1910s. Then the rise of militarism or fascism, if you like, in Japan begins with the hostility towards these groups by the simple, if you like, rural population. The military officers often came from humble rural backgrounds. The first landmark or incident marking the rise of fascism in Japan is an assassination attempt where a military officer tries to shoot the head of the largest business group, largest zaibatsu, in 1931. And then the military tries to replace them, but it's already difficult because they dominate the economy. The military tries to set up what they call new zaibatsu. The new zaibatsu you're probably driving in your garage. Toyota and Nissan are descendants of the new zaibatsu, which were originally meant for military vehicles, but it's impossible to get rid of them. And during the war, they accumulate even more power because of the need for, chemicals, metals, etc. They set up factories in the colonies, mostly Korea and Manchuria. And so they are perceived as the great beneficiaries of the war, even though initially the military was, so there was some kind of hostility between them and the military. So they accumulate power over, I guess, a 60 or 70 year period prior to the war. They reach the zenith or peak during the war, and then they are an obvious target for the American reformers. By the way, the same people to some extent who had been involved in the Roosevelt reform in the 1930s, or some of the same ideas for sure, yes? Because this seems like a total contrast with America.
That's really fascinating. We have a very last question, short question, short answer. Alejandro Sepulveda asks, what do you think is more dangerous for consumers? Increase regulatory capture or increase firm consolidation? I know it's hard to
didn't hear
choose.
the second one.
Increase the regulatory capture or increase the firm consolidation?
This is a tough one. I don't know.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, both of them are unappealing. Yes, I mean, consolidate.
So maybe you can answer what comes first. So
I mean, regulatory capture, I would say, is unambiguously bad.
okay.
Consolidation, I guess economists, or as economists, we don't like it, but you can come up with some contrived situations where some form of consolidation might be justified. I don't know, think about the current crisis, maybe, you know, some consolidation in the airline industry is inevitable. So I guess both of them are bad, but regulatory capture is unambiguously bad, and consolidation in normal times is probably unappealing, but under special circumstances, maybe, you know, sometimes it can be okay.
Okay, thank you so much. We were perfectly on time. Okay, Augustine is super active today.
Okay, I
and
guess
he
there
says,
is one more minute if there is, I mean, if you want, Augustine.
He says he wants to highlight that cost savings is a typical excuse for consolidation. And yeah, we have a lot
Yes, absolutely. So there are reasons for why consolidation may be good, but I think Augustine and everybody else here will be hard pressed to come up with a reason why regulatory capture may, under any circumstances, be good.
Yeah, especially if you read ProMarket.org, if you listen to Luigi Zingales and Kate Waldock podcast Capitalism, and if you participate to Stigler Center events. So basically, thank you, Yishay, very much. It was super interesting, and thank to all the people who participate in this lively discussion. And that's all for today, but stay tuned because we have plenty of other initiatives, and hopefully we'll have a full conference in September if the COVID-19 allows us to organize it. Okay, thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you again, Yishay.
Thank you.